Welcome to the Wisdom of Show. I'm your host, Simon Bowen, and every week I'm speaking to the world's greatest leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs about complex issues and impactful leadership. Join us in the Renaissance of Wisdom. Well, welcome to the wisdom of Dr. Kimberly Nicholas. You know, we live in an increasingly complex world. I say this all the time, increasing political, social, economic, and environmental issues confronting us. And in a world that's driven by tips and tricks and hacks and trends and things like that, we do need purpose-driven, wisdom-driven leaders to challenge us to think about how we're engaging, what we're doing, and what the paradigm shifts might be that we need to make to really drive and strive for a much, much better result. And I'm thrilled, Kimberly, to be able to interview you today because it's about a topic that we should all be really thinking about, which is actually our impact on the planet. And if we have some time, I might share a model of my own because I think it will actually gel very directly with one of the models that you speak about. And so the goal of this show is to really explore some meaty topics with people that are genuine. I don't use the term thought leader. It's a commoditized term these days, but are some of the wisest thinkers around. And Kimberly, with your permission, I know it's awkward, but I really want people to understand a little bit about what you're doing. And I'd like to just read through a snapshot, not the full brief. So Dr. Kimberly Nicholas is an associate professor of sustainability science at Lund, Sweden's highest ranked university. And she's the author, right behind her there, a book, Under the Sky We Make. So How to Be Human in a Warming World, which is a fascinating title. And she writes for publications including The Guardian, Scientific American, New Scientist, Elle, Decanter, and Carbon Brief. You're the founder of We Can Fix It, a consultancy offering strategy, public speaking events, coaching, and writing to galvanize high-impact climate action. So her Substack, with actionable evidence-based advice on facing the climate crisis, is hitting about just under 6,000 subscribers now.
We're at 7,000 actually. That's an update.
Pardon?
We're at 7,000 subscribers now. That's an update.
Need to change that number.
Oh, sorry. Okay, got to update my website.
Update, yes. Change the number. Claim the 7,000. And in her research, she's studying the connections between people, land, and climate with the goal of stewardship, which is a really fascinating topic. Kimberly, I'd love us to talk a little bit about the notion of stewardship as opposed to leadership. I think they're different things, and I think they're important to to walk through. Stewarding the ecosystems to support a good life for everyone alive today and leave a thriving planet for future generations, which is kind of one of the hallmarks of stewardship. Her research has been featured in outlets including the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Wired, National Public Radio International, Vox, USA Today, and profiled in Elle, New Scientist, Science, and The Guardian, and so much more. As I unpack that we would spend the whole time working through the body of work that you've amassed, right? In an area that a lot of people would rather ignore. A lot of people just are maybe not even aware, and I know that awareness is kind of one of the issues, an area that a lot of people are worried about. But it is a complex picture, although maybe it's not. I'd love you to lean in on climate science 101, because I think it's a great place to start, because a lot of people might be a bit might have lost hope, if that makes some sense. And I think it'd be a great place to start with climate science 101. If you could just sort of step through those chunks for us, please. I think that'd be a great place to start.
Yes, thank you, Simon. I would love to. So Climate Science 101 is basically what science tells us, what we need to know about climate change. It is almost a haiku if you don't count the syllables too carefully. Yeah. So it's 5 things we need to know, which is it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it.
And the last bit is the important bit, right? Because people need hope, otherwise they give up. You just repeat those again for us. And let's just kind of touch on each one of them just with maybe a sentence or two. That is one of the most punch you in the face summaries of what's going on with the climate that is also a really welcome message, which is we can fix it. So I'd love you to go through them again, maybe with a subhead on each of those 5 chunks.
Sure. So starting with it's warming, it's unequivocal. It's just a fact that the climate is warming. By now, everyone sees the evidence with your own eyes, but we also have millions of data points of scientific data from around the world, from above the world, from satellites, from the bottom of the oceans, everywhere in between. So planet Earth is warming, and it's because of human activities, primarily burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas.
So
That's causing.
So it's us.
Exactly.
Yep.
And that is just a scientific fact that it's listed as unequivocal by the scientific body, the UN climate panel called the IPCC, and that's been signed off on by all the world's governments. So that is just an incontrovertible fact that it's warming and it's caused by us, primarily from fossil fuel. Then we're sure there's an overwhelming scientific consensus, and this has been building for, well, really, it's more than a century, but definitely in the last few decades, it's gotten extremely strong, much stronger than when I was in graduate school 20 years ago. So every study that comes out really reaffirms how certain we are that the current warming is caused by humans. That was up for more discussion or debate. The evidence was not as strong, a few decades ago, but now it's extremely clear that there's overwhelming scientific consensus on that fact. And that matters because research shows that for the public to support meaningful climate action, it's really important that they understand that there is this strong scientific consensus.
There are still people trying to dispute the science in multiple arenas. And, I often talk about to form and hold on to an opinion, you need 2 things. To form an opinion, you do need data points, you need evidence, you need facts, maybe you need some experience. Information helps you form an opinion. The problem is to hold on to an opinion is you need ignorance. So you can only continue to believe that the world is flat as long as you remain ignorant of all other evidence to the contrary. And so to protect your opinion, you have to maintain your ignorance about all of the evidence to the contrary. And people don't necessarily love it when I kind of put that viewpoint in front of people, but there is definitely still that endeavor, right, to dispute some of the science and, bring it down and quote reports and things like that. So, it's warming, it's us. I think the next one was it's bad.
It's warming, it's us, we're sure.
Oh, we're sure.
Which we've talked about those first 3 now.
Yeah. And what would you say to people? Like equip our audience with the best response you can think of when they're in a conversation and someone says, I don't think climate change is real. And, it's unequivocal. The evidence is there from on and above, everything you've just spoken about. How would we equip people who are not scientists, don't have the evidence at their fingertips, which is why I loved your 5 points, like it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, and then of course hope we can fix this. But how would you equip people just to be able to contend with the naysayers of all of the evidence?
Actually, I don't think that's necessary, and I don't even think it's a good use of time. So
Fantastic.
I would say, I also don't think it's that likely, even though climate deniers or climate skeptics, are very loud, and you might, and I've run into them on the internet for sure. They're less than 10% of the population, and that's true in places like Australia and the US and in Western Europe. So the vast majority of people are already concerned or alarmed about climate change. They're worried about, they know it's not a belief. If it's a fact, you either know it or you don't. So it's a fact that it's warming, it's us, we're sure. And most people do know that fact and are concerned about its implications. And
Yeah.
I think the challenge we have now is to act on that knowledge fast enough to stabilize the climate and avert the most harmful impacts. So it's not going to be the skeptics who do that. And it's not going to be, I think probably for the amount of time you might have to spend to convince one skeptic, you could activate 1,000 people to take really high impact action. And that's a much better use of your time. So I personally think you can ignore the skeptics. I mean, the problem comes when they are in Congress or
Yeah.
running companies or in positions of power, which unfortunately still can be the case. So,
Yeah.
it's not that we can completely leave them out. And we do have really good investigative journalism and academic research showing this really unfortunate history of deliberate disinformation and deception by many of the large fossil fuel companies, for example, to deliberately sow doubt on the science in order to do what's called predatory delay, to delay actions that might affect their business model, which is wrecking the climate. So
Yeah. Right.
it's a serious issue, but I think for most of your listeners, it's probably not where their time is best spent. If you do want to look at how to debunk misinformation and deal with skeptics, John Cook has some fabulous resources. He's studied disinformation, denialism, how to overcome it, something called the truth sandwich, where you start by stating the fact, then state the misinformation and correct it with another fact. So there are techniques out there. But again, I don't think your listeners have to
Well, I
feel
think,
obliged to debunk.
yeah, I think your response is fantastic, which is, turn your limited amount of time and personal energy into things that have an impact rather than the debate, particularly, for the average person, if it's kind of 10% of of the population. That number is probably true in most major change. In fact, if it was that low on a lot of change, it would be incredible, right? So if we've actually gotten to this point where about 90% of people, believe that it's real and are concerned about it, let's talk about it's warming, it's us, we're
We're
sure,
sure.
and
Yeah.
then we've got it's bad and we can fix
Yeah.
it. Let's get to the
Right.
top part of that.
Right. So it's bad. Again, this is something in the last 20 years has become overwhelmingly clear. When I was in graduate school in the early 2000s, it used to be more common to talk about, sort of the costs and benefits of climate change, like kind of weighing up, well, there will be some damages, but perhaps there'll also be some benefits, like if the Arctic melts, then we can have shipping over the north, and maybe that will open up new economic opportunities. And now we've really realized, and we have really overwhelming evidence. I mean, a recent paper with more than 4,000 studies combined just really puts together how overwhelmingly bad the impacts of climate change are. They're bad for human health, they're bad for food production, they're bad for ecosystems, for plants and animals that we depend on. They're bad for mental health, they're bad for violence. They have just an incredible number, water supply, sanitation, gender equality, pretty much anything that we might care about as
Mm.
people is currently already being made worse by climate change. A simple example is income inequality has already been made 25% worse between rich and poor countries from climate change. So that's the world we
Oh.
live in today. And climate change has been called a threat multiplier, that it makes existing risks and existing crises worse, more difficult, harder to solve. So, it's overwhelmingly clear that the impacts of climate change are very bad. Most of us have experienced many personally, like myself with my family being evacuated from California wildfires, which were made much more likely by human-caused climate change. In Australia, of course, there have been many,
Mm.
many devastating impacts as well. So people are realizing, okay, these are intolerable and, unbearable impacts that we have to avoid. And that just pushes us towards getting to this fifth step of, okay, we can fix it. How will we do that? What does it take?
And a lot of the content that I have consumed, and I tend to try and go towards, science rather, the scientific community rather than influences on this. But I've been hearing repeated patterns about, we have some technologies that can move the dial a bit. We are making some progress. There is some reason for hope in terms of, we've been slow, maybe slower than we would have liked to have responded to this, but there is some progress to be acknowledged, and we can fix this. Can you walk us through some of the things that you've seen or been involved in that would actually give people that sense of hope that we can fix this? Here's some things that we're doing that are really, having some impact and probably will.
Sure. So I think it's really important for listeners to understand, what will it take to stop warming? What will it take to stabilize the climate?
Mm,
The answer is humans have to completely stop adding carbon to the atmosphere. And when you consider that today our economy is about 80% of our energy comes from fossil fuels, which is
mm,
old plants, 400 million year old plants and swamps that have been buried underground for millions, 400 million years or so. They're kind of captured sunlight from this previous geological era, and heat and time and pressure and temperature have transformed them to fossil fuels. So when we burn those to heat and light our homes and move our cars and planes around, et cetera, we're adding carbon back to the atmosphere that was originally taken up by plants and hasn't been part of the carbon cycle in 400 million years. So we've got to completely stop doing that to stabilize the climate. It means we have to completely shift all of our energy systems away from burning fossil fuels, shut down those coal and oil and gas uses, and replace them with sustainable clean energy.
mm.
And once we do that, we will stop warming. That's the majority of warming comes from fossil fuels. There's two pieces basically. What it will take to stabilize the climate is stop burning fossil fuels and stop destroying nature, to stop deforestation and disturbing soil, that living carbon that's in ecosystems now today. Those have to stay in place and be allowed to be healthy and recover. And we know what we have to do and how to do it. So now it's really a question of implementation. We already have today ready to go, in use and ready to scale up, the technologies we need to eliminate about 75% of today's emissions. So that's really good news. Basically, the plan is electrify everything and generate a lot of clean electricity. And those are things we know how to do. The remaining 25% are they're called the hard to decarbonize sectors. That's things like cement, steel, aviation. So there are technical challenges there, but we don't have time to wait to solve those. So we need to get going on implementing what we have ready and keep moving ahead for the scientists and engineers on the research front to get that last 25% in place.
So does business, does commerce and free enterprise have a role to play in that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is in climate finance. We know that we need to scale up climate finance about 6 times in order to meet the climate challenge, to stabilize the climate, and to allow countries that are already impacted to prepare and prevent further harm. So money comes primarily from businesses. That's where the money gets generated. So I think finding ways of financing climate action is going to be a really, really important business model for the future.
Yeah. And, when we talk about the environment in general, and some people have their focus on the ocean and plastics and the health of the ocean, and then others on other parts of, the general ecosystem. But listening to the conversation, the big game right now is completely stop putting carbon into the, into the atmosphere and deal with that first. Is that a fair assumption? Or is it integrated? Do we have to do everything?
I mean, I don't, there are lots of important issues. It can be bad to kind of get into the game of ranking, my issue is more important than yours type of thing. And we certainly need to be smart about how we invest our time and money and resources so that we're not inadvertently creating, worsening other problems while trying to solve one problem. The good news is, I mean, the thing that keeps me up at night is the climate problem, and that's what I've dedicated my life to working on. And I think there's a good argument to be made. We absolutely have to solve that, and the urgency of that one is really critical because we're in the last few months, really, of our carbon budget. So we have this total amount of carbon from fossil fuels and deforestation that humanity can burn, and that's a permanent budget. That's not an annual budget. That's a budget for all people who have or ever will live for all of time. And so far we've used up more than 90% of that budget.
Can
So
you
we're
expand? Can you just expand on the carbon budget? That was this is the total budget for all of people for all of time. Can you just
yeah, it's
simplify
pretty hard
that
to
for
wrap
people to
your
wrap their
head
head
around.
around? Yeah.
It's a really different way of thinking. And the reason that we have this permanent carbon budget is because carbon is essentially forever. Some of, my ancestors came from what is now Ukraine to the US about 100 and more than 110, 15 years ago. And some of the carbon that powered my great grandmother's escape really across the continent of Europe on coal-fired trains and on a steamship across the Atlantic, that carbon is still in the atmosphere. So I never met her, but her carbon legacy is something that is a permanent part of my life and everyone else's life on Earth. And as long as that carbon is in the atmosphere, it's continuing to cause warming. So some of the carbon we burn today will still be in the atmosphere 10,000 years from now. And when you consider that Stonehenge or the Great Pyramids are roughly half that old, there's really nothing that humans are doing, or that certainly I think you or I or any of us personally are doing, that will last as long and have as big of an impact and a legacy as our carbon legacy that we leave on this planet. Because that's just the thermostat for the whole world. That determines what kind of crops can grow where, who can live where, how many people can live a good life on Earth, where they can live, whether it rains or not on their crops. I mean, it just is this absolutely fundamental precursor to having the possibility of a good life on Earth. So that's why I think climate is so urgent and important for us to solve now.
Is there any technological research or innovative research into whether it's possible to strip any of that carbon out, through other means other than natural cycles? Is it even possible, or is it not even worth thinking about?
It's probably going to be necessary for the last 5 or 10% of emissions that we don't have a feasible way of avoiding. It is definitely not going to be sufficient if we don't eliminate the other 90%.
Yeah. The carbon budget, and that's the first time I've heard someone express that like that, is such a powerful concept for people to actually wrap their head around. And it's pretty sobering, but we can fix it if we completely stop putting more carbon up there and start to take some affirmative action. I'd love to change gears. Actually, before I do that, I want to move into stewardship, because you spoke about legacies through generations, and you're obviously a kind of a vision-led and legacy-led person trying to create things for generations that may never know you, but trying to have an impact. And you spoke about, a generation that you never knew, leaving a part of the carbon budget up there. So I want to lean into stewardship shortly, because you have a wide experience of being in front of groups and working with people and operating across a multidisciplinary approach through academia and consulting and so on. But I'd love you to walk through, the 5 stages framework that you share with me. I think it's probably important for people to also get that shaped in their head, and particularly, the feelings part of it. But I'd love you to walk through that framework, if that's okay.
Sure. So in my work, I'm trying to link facts, feelings, and action. And we've been talking about the facts of climate change, this Climate 101. The feelings, to me, is certainly not what I was taught in grad school, being trained as a climate scientist, but I've had to come to and realize that they're absolutely essential to sustain us and point us in the direction of meaningful work that we can actually sustain in the long haul, because this is a life's work and the work of, honestly, more than one generation, although ours is the most important. If you're alive now, you are the most important generation that has ever lived, because we are the stewards of this last tiny sliver of our remaining carbon budget. So the feelings framework that I developed is based on these 5 stages that I've experienced and seen others go through. And those are ignorance, avoidance, doom, all the feels, and purpose. And basically the idea there is that, we all start in ignorance. No one is born with a genetically programmed understanding of climate change and how it works and where it comes from and what we need to do. So we need to learn about it. And often a reaction when we do learn more is avoidance, because the news is bad and scary, and it's quite late in the climate crisis, and people in power who should have acted have not. And it's a lot of tough information to take in. So often that can lead to the third stage, which is doom. That's when you fall down this dark rabbit hole of Googling late at night. And I've Googled climate change, when to give up. I understand those feelings, and I think we all have faced them. But the way through doom is not the end. I think people are stuck in avoidance because they're afraid that doom is the end. Doom can lead to all the feels. And that is basically creating space and developing healthy practices to allow yourself to have all the feels, like grief for the things that we have already lost or will lose to the climate crisis. There have been real losses. I mean, it has been really heartbreaking for me to see some of my favorite places in California burned by wildfires that are much bigger and more severe than they should be because of the human contribution to climate change. We need to make space for emotions like anger at the injustice of climate change, that it's people, young people, poor people, marginalized people who've done the least to cause the crisis, who are suffering the worst impacts, and the injustice of that can be really infuriating. But those emotions, as well as emotions like solidarity, creativity, positive energy, basically, if we have ways to cope with those emotions, they can point us in the direction of our purpose. And that's the fifth stage, where we're basically living in line with our values, that our actions are helping to bring about this world that we want to create. And that is a big part of finding meaning in our lives. So even though there are many terrible things about the climate crisis, I really believe that it also offers us a crucible to make meaning in our lives, because it gives us a valued role to play. It connects us with others. It lets us experience, this exquisite and terrifying moment of being alive and the power and responsibility that we have. And it points us in ways that we can use our unique talents and gifts, whatever they are, to help do what's necessary.
It's interesting, humans only care about the future if it has them in it. It's an oddity of the human condition. If we said to everyone, we will be extinct as a species through natural causes by 2100, what would the interest be in better stewardship of the environment? So humans are a fairly self-centered species. We care about the future if it has us in it. And because we have this ability for, metacognition, meta thought, we can contemplate, the impact we're having and what would it look like with us and without us. And having that sense of future, that purpose, is actually key to people wanting to participate in the future and lean in on, well, what's the role that I play? And am I, do I need to be a leader? Do I need to be a steward? This idea of stewarding the ecosystem. And I'd love to lean in on the concepts of stewardship. It's something that I've spoken about for a long time, and a long time in business, where there is a principle of stewardship that says, you take what was gifted to you and return it with increase. And so you take the planet that was gifted to you when you were born, live your life, and then return it in a better shape, obviously, or with increase at the end of your time. And real stewardship is when you create a better situation for a generation of people you're never going to meet. So you will never get to live inside the glory of something that you might have done. You may be written up in history in the consequences of something you've done from a negative perspective, but stewardship is a really interesting concept. And I think business is one of the most powerful forces for good on the planet if the right people are leading it and stewarding those businesses. I'd love to step into some of your perspectives on stewarding the ecosystem and just the concept of leaders and people, even individuals, as stewards of the climate and of this change that we need to bring about. I don't know how deeply you've delved into that, but it is an interesting topic area. It's a level above leadership, and you're in conversations with people all the time that might be talking about those things. I'd love to pour in on this idea of stewarding ecosystems for future generations.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate those thoughts and the definitions that you've offered. To me, something I think about when I think about stewardship in the context of the planetary health and climate system is, to me, about a relationship that people have with nature. And it's really fundamental, I think, for us to successfully do what's necessary, both to motivate us and to actually succeed in doing it, is to have a relationship with nature that we can sustain, to not just see nature and the planet as resources there for us to consume and use up, but to understand and respect the natural cycles of the planet, that there are rates of regeneration. For example, if you plant a tree, it's not going to be ready for you to harvest next year. You have to wait 80 years. If you plant a crop, the tomato seeds that you plant in March, you need to wait until August to harvest them. There's these natural cycles that we have to get attuned to and learn to basically live within and in a relationship that is more reciprocal, where humans can be benefiting and contributing positively to the earth rather than just taking. So that's part of something that I think about a lot. And to me, it's part of what I call the regeneration mindset, that basically I see my sort of philosophy is that a lot of our problems today are caused by the exploitation mindset, this idea that humans are superior to nature and that some humans are superior to other humans. And I think these two mistaken views lead to a lot of our problems. And if we get into a mindset of regeneration, which is about improving and adding to and leaving better than we found and working with rather than against nature, we can do that by doing three things. It's basically treating symptoms, or going to the source of problems, not treating their symptoms. So getting to root causes, really centering the health and well-being of both people and nature, and building resilience, which is the ability to cope with and even thrive through change. So those are the ways that I see the sort of pathways to achieve regeneration, which I think is closely aligned with your view on stewardship.
Yeah, increasingly, time is a fascinating topic. Time beats everyone eventually. And it does its own thing, no matter how powerful we think we are, and one of the things that I see happening that does challenge this idea of stewardship is impatience. Humans want everything to happen in human time, not necessarily nature's time, or not necessarily the system's time, if you like. And sometimes when you force things to make them happen in human time rather than the timing of the natural system, you break things along the way. You put undue pressure on the system, whether that's an ecosystem or a business system or whatever the case might be. We're very driven by the needs of our species rather than this regeneration mindset that you're talking about. So I'm pretty interested in. We've touched really briefly on the sorts of things business can do, including financing, and I suppose there's also tremendous opportunity for entrepreneurs who know how to get stuff done, because it's one of the things that entrepreneurs are great at. There's a marketplace to look at for the kinds of business that you could run in this space to have a very real impact on how do we stop carbon completely. And there's obviously going to be enormous opportunity that will come with that. So business certainly has a role to play. I guess governments certainly have a role to play as well. But you also talk a lot about personalized climate action. And, it's an interesting kind of conversation. And I also I keep looking at Under the Sky We Make, How to Be Human in a Warming World, right by your shoulder there. And I'd really value it if you could pull some observations maybe from the book, and also thinking about personalized climate action for individuals specifically that might be listening. What are the things that we can all do? 70% roughly is energy. We've got to deal with that, right? But people can have an impact as well. I'd love to draw you into that conversation a little bit.
Right. So we've identified 5 climate superpowers, which are our roles as consumers, investors, role models, professionals, and citizens. And if you're lucky enough to earn more than 38,000 US dollars per year, which most people, for example, in North America, Western Europe, I imagine Australia as well are, then you're in the top 10% richest people on Earth. And you're in a group that does need to look at your own carbon footprint, like me. So about 90% of the planet does not need to reduce their carbon footprint. If we make these changes on a system level, so we have clean energy, transportation, a food system that's not destroying the planet, those changes will be enough. But for this top 10% group, there's also an overconsumption piece to deal with. And when we hear overconsumption, we often might think of stuff that we buy at the store and hold in our hands, but actually about 2/3 of emissions from that group come from flying and driving. So the biggest thing we can do as individuals, if we're in this elite group that does need to look at our own footprint, is to reduce or stop our flying and driving. Meat consumption also makes that list of a high impact climate action. And I would say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good there. I really avoided looking at my own flying for a long time because I couldn't imagine a world where I would completely stop flying. But I was able to reduce my flying about 90%. And I decided in my case to stop flying within Europe where I live. And that led to a lot of other changes as well, also to romance. My 4th date with my husband was taking a 15-hour train trip to Paris, which I highly recommend. So, it's possible to do what you can there. But as a consumer, that's really important for those of us in that group, and maybe for businesses to think about how to make their business model work in that way to, promote less travel by plane and car, to promote less meat consumption. Less consumption overall actually is an important business model that we need to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And the human species left to its own device is a net consumer. And the continuum between consumption and contribution is quite vast. I mean, I don't think I can remember a time where there were so many stories of better air quality and things like that than there was during COVID, which had all sorts of other horrible impacts. However, the world stopped flying, and we stopped driving. And, we all saw the stories about the canals in Venice and, skies over previously, smoke-filled cities and things like that. We have a recent historical, anecdotal, real-world example of exactly what you're talking about in terms of flying and driving. Last thing, and then I've got some quick questions I'd love to ask you, which are not about the climate. They're just let's know a bit more, about Kimberly. But before I do that, what's the most important message you would want people to get from Under the Sky We Make as they read the book? What's the really meaty message you'd love people to get from reading the book? And it might not even be written in there. It might be woven through it, but it's the bigger contextual message you'd love them to get from that.
I would love readers to come away feeling that they understand what needs to be done and they know how they can do it. So I think a big part of this book is to kind of demystify what climate action looks like in the real world and what the really practical, sometimes boring everyday steps are that we need to take. And nobody can or should take each and every one, but we all can take some of them. And I think if we use our superpowers, so we've talked about consumer, but also how we influence others as role models, how we spend our time and money as investors, where and how we work in our business lives, and how we engage as citizens, we have so much power that we're not using. And I think I want people to feel this sense of agency and energy, that there are things that you can do that really matter, that make a difference. And you can focus on the things that are most meaningful and make the biggest difference within your life that you live now. It's not even a huge change. I mean, 20 minutes a day would honestly be transformational. And that's something that I'm working on at the moment, is a personalized climate action guide that guides people through what is the highest impact action that they can personally take. It's information that I put out there in Under the Sky We Make. It's in my Substack. We can fix it. But to put it in really, really, really concrete terms of spelling out, what does this look like on your day-to-day life? So I hope that people feel less alone and have specific ideas of what they can do and the motivation to do it.
And remember and know that we can fix it. This is not a lost cause at all, and it's worth fighting for, right? We can fix it. And there are things that people can do.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, humanity, step one of fixing it is stabilize the climate, stop warming. That's the goal of the Paris Agreement, is to stabilize warming at a given level as low as possible. I mean, even going beyond that, in the longer term, we might try to repair the damage we've done and not just stabilize at a worse level, but even reverse and repair and regenerate the climate to restore it to a pre-industrial level. That would be a whole nother level of fixing it. And my colleague Rob Jackson has a book coming out about how to do that, which I think is really exciting. So, there really is a lot of opportunity. And I think for a business audience who has, the talent and energy to create and bring things to market, it's so important that we harness that energy to do what really matters. And I don't think there's anything more important than leaving a good climate for ourselves and future generations.
Absolutely. And, we could lead the conversation into all sorts of other dimensions, political, social, international conflict, all sorts of things that are going on in the world right now. But what I so appreciate you doing over the last little period of time is it's another whole show about how you communicate to people, because you do communicate, you simplify this complexity without dumbing it down, which is a really powerful thing for someone to be able to do. Dumbing down is insulting. Simplifying complexity, though, is the greatest form of sophistication. And I think there's just been such strong messages that you've sent here that if we just hold on to those and then play the role, figure out which one of those 5 roles, or which couple of those 5 roles we're in, and play that role, there is hope, because we can fix it. Even though, it's warming.
It's us.
It's us. It's bad, right?
And we can fix it.
And we can fix it, right? So what I'd love to finish off with is just some quick questions to get inside your mind, and then we'll wrap it up. And they're kind of from left field. If you could travel to any period in history, where would you go to and why?
Oh, gosh. I'm so curious about the future. I mean, I love climate fiction. It's a really helpful way. I'm part of a climate fiction book club, and we've read a bunch of novels that deal with climate change one way or another. And I just find it so helpful to use imagination and sort of inhabit someone else's world in a large range of different futures. I really like the work of Kim Stanley Robinson. Ministry for the Future has gotten a ton of attention, very well deserved, but I think New York 2140 is probably my favorite book of his, like imagining what could be a good future for New York, which is partly flooded in 2140, but people lead good lives and have, repaired a lot of damage. So I would be really curious to see the future.
Sure. And so then, hand in hand with time, a period in time, if we look back at historical figures, and you could get inside the mind of a historical figure, spend a day inside the mind, who would that be? And what would that reason be?
Well, the first person who popped to my mind would be Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, just such a wildly creative person who thought about things in such an incredible way. I really like how he connected art and science. And I think in his time, those things weren't quite as separated as they are today. I think I would find that so interesting. It feels to me like he really looked at the world around him, and it would be so interesting to see how he made those observations and connections that he did.
Yeah, I think a lot about Einstein, and it fascinates me, and Leonardo da Vinci is the same. So much of what they wrote about was almost imagined or imagery. You know, it was a mathematical equation, or it was, Da Vinci's documenting of the human anatomy, well ahead of his time, and helicopter diagrams and all this sort of business can only come from the mind. They had nothing to do it with, at the time. So it's quite fascinating. And as you said before, imagination may be a really, really powerful tool. And I'd love to know if you could have been in the room of any important negotiation, and I'm going to add to it, which I don't normally, and you could impact it. What would that negotiation be?
I actually feel like I got to live that dream because I was in the room where the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. I can't claim that I had an impact on it, but I was there as an observer for Lund University, and it really felt like the whole world was holding its breath and watching those world leaders adopt this agreement to stabilize the climate. And I mean, we're not making enough progress. Most countries are not on track to meet their targets. But we do have on paper, and we have this agreement, and we need to hold our governments accountable to deliver what they've promised us and what democracies have demanded, which is a safe and stable climate. So I feel like I actually got to be there, and that really changed the course of my life and my focus. So I'm really grateful I had that opportunity, and that's something I always will take with me.
Fantastic. Well, Kimberly, I want to thank you so much for the time you've so generously given us. And I want to thank people that have stayed with the show all the way through this particular episode. It's a conversation that really none of us can afford to ignore. And it's one of those conversations that we have to have from an informed position. It can't be taken from a thought up sort of position. We've got to study the facts and the evidence and the science and make really good decisions. I would encourage entrepreneurs and business leaders to think about how your business can play a role in contributing to stopping carbon going to the atmosphere from human production. How can we play a role in making sure that we preserve the last small part of the carbon budget? And whether that's through financing, for these initiatives, or actually stepping into some technology or bringing to market and making things happen, or just being a part of it. How, at an individual level, can you play a part? 20 minutes a day, with a bit of an action plan to personalize, the climate action that you can take. I think they're all fabulous messages. Kimberly is an academic, provides consultancy around this, is involved in a lot of organizations in terms of this. So I would encourage people to go and look at her website, have a look at the material, buy Under the Sky We Make, and understand more about how to be a human in a warming planet. And Kimberly, thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Simon. It was a real pleasure.
No, the pleasure was actually all mine. Thank you.